I'm now so excited and so honored to move us into our next section that we're going to kick off with just such an absolutely incredible speaker and really inspiration to me. I kind of can't believe that I get to introduce her. So this section is titled Coronavirus and Disaster Capitalism. It's my absolute pleasure to introduce Naomi Klein to lead us through here. So Naomi, as I'm sure you all know, is an award-winning journalist, New York Times bestselling author, senior correspondent at The Intercept, Puffin Writing Fellow at the Type Media Center, and I know that she's provided the roadmap for a lot of us for moments like this, for these disaster capitalism moments and the shock doctrine that comes after. So again, it's my real honor to be able to introduce Naomi and take it away.
Hi, everyone. I am so happy to be with you. Thank you so much for that introduction. April, thank you so much for those beautiful, moving words, for grounding us in place and in time. You know, I'm not super comfortable with this technology. I much prefer to be in rooms with human bodies. But it's really lovely scrolling through all the faces and seeing so many friends and colleagues and heroes, and to feel the power of this movement, and to know that so much organizing work, so much intellectual work is represented in this conversation, and in so many ways, so much disaster preparedness. When I wrote The Shock Doctrine, which came out 13 years ago now, I started writing it long before that. It was a book that was a good 6 years in the making. It really felt as if a lot of us didn't understand how the strategy that I was writing about in the book, the use of shocks and disasters, had been used so systematically and so ubiquitously in order to impose brutal economic policies. Certainly there were people who did understand it, who had experienced it, and I often say that I never would have written The Shock Doctrine had I not lived in Argentina in 2002 and 2003 and learned from my Argentinian friends about how neoliberalism had come to their continent in blood and fire, and how the shock of military coups and the literal shocks of torture and repression had been used as the softening up to impose what economists then proudly described as economic shock therapy, using people's dislocation, terror, fear, in order to impose policies that would have been impossible to impose under other circumstances. But the more I looked into it, the more I saw this pattern recur again and again. And of course, the coronavirus is no different. We know that that pandemics have been very powerful tools for the imposition of capitalism throughout history, certainly in the Americas. Smallpox was the greatest killer and tool of genocide against indigenous peoples. This is a virus that, while it impacts everyone, like all disasters, it doesn't impact equally. And we know that our elders are more vulnerable to this disease. But it's also true that anybody who has a range of pre-existing medical conditions, but particularly respiratory weaknesses, are vulnerable to the virus, are particularly vulnerable to the virus. And we also know that those illnesses are unevenly distributed because pollution is unevenly distributed. And pollution is racistly distributed throughout the United States through communities of color, indigenous communities. And so that means that the preconditions for vulnerability are cited in those communities. And I think, as you know, we're hearing anecdotal reports from healthcare workers about who is most impacted. We don't have the data yet, but we have every reason to believe that the people who are going to be most overrepresented in the death counts are going to be people coming from those communities. And so it is particularly outrageous that in the last few days, we have heard news that the Trump administration is using this crisis to attack environmental standards, including those specifically regulating air pollution, rolling back emissions standards, and relaxing or just refusing to enforce the full panoply of EPA regulations. And of course, this has been the wish list of fossil fuel companies. The American Petroleum Association was pushing for this before it was already announced. The coal companies have said that in the name of this pandemic, they shouldn't have to pay into the funds that they have for workers with black lung disease. Just today, many of you know I'm both Canadian and American. I'm speaking to you from New Jersey. My family is still in Canada, and I grew up in Canada and lived there most of my life. And I'm very ashamed to share with you that there's a great deal of disaster capitalism going on worldwide, from Netanyahu using this crisis to stage a palace coup, to Viktor Orban, the Prime Minister of Hungary, using this crisis to allow himself to rule by decree indefinitely. You're more familiar, I'm sure, with what Trump has done. Let me tell you what Jason Kenney, the Premier of Alberta, has done. Over the weekend, he used this crisis to attack education workers and introduce cuts that our trade unions in Alberta estimate will lead to layoffs of upwards of 20,000 education workers in the midst of this pandemic. 20,000 education workers being laid off. Then today, he somehow found $7 billion for what? $7 billion to subsidize the Keystone XL pipeline, which will go from Alberta through the United States to the Gulf Coast. So this is, what I mean by disaster capitalism, or the shock doctrine, using these states of crisis, the fact that people are obviously having to focus on their daily emergencies, or just deal with being sick themselves because the pandemic is real, or care for loved ones, or figure out how to homeschool their kids, or work harder than they've ever worked because they are a frontline essential worker. But in a context like that, it is particularly hard to be an engaged participant in your democracy, to hold politicians accountable. And so it is in that context where it becomes possible to do what Milton Friedman described, and many of you have heard me quote him before, when he wrote in 1980, "Only a crisis, actual or perceived, produces real change. When that crisis occurs, the actions that are taken depend on the ideas that are lying around." And he went on to say, "That, I believe, is our basic function, to keep the ideas ready until the politically impossible becomes politically inevitable." Now, Milton Friedman came up with this strategy and these sort of marching orders for the American right, in large part because he understood that crises that laid bare the injustices, the failures of capitalism were actually very ripe moments for progressive movements. And in the shock doctrine, I quoted a letter that Milton Friedman wrote to Augusto Pinochet shortly after the military coup, where he was imploring Pinochet to impose shock treatment on the economy, as Milton Friedman called it repeatedly in that letter. And he was trying to to steal Pinochet's spine. Can you imagine an economist feeling the need to steal the spine of one of the most brutal dictators in history? But he felt that Pinochet wasn't moving fast enough in laying off workers, in deregulating the economy, in privatizing the economy. And he said to Pinochet, he said that things took a wrong turn in your country as well as mine in the 1930s, when people started to believe that they could do good with other people's money. That's a direct quote. Now, what was Friedman referring to? Well, he was referring to the gains made by working people under the New Deal. And as we know, many workers were excluded from those gains, particularly African-American workers, women workers, Mexican workers, many of whom were deported in the lead up to the New Deal. But the fact remains that the New Deal was the era where Social Security was introduced, unemployment insurance was introduced, where the banks were broken up, where there was huge investments in public housing and in electrification for poor rural areas. And this was understood to have been the result of people responding to a shock, seeing the failures of capitalism, coming together with a newfound sense of power and purpose in order to weave a social safety net and try to build a better world. They believed that everything went wrong in that moment, right? And for that reason, there had to be this right-wing disaster preparedness strategy to make sure that whenever there is a crisis produced by capital, that it is the right that moves into that vacuum and moves quicker than anybody else can move, because they are so scared that these moments of revelation, really, of unveiling, as our friends in Puerto Rico described Hurricane Maria as a moment of unveiling that showed the inequities that predated the hurricane, that these can be moments, revolutionary moments for the left. And so we are not in the same moment that we were in the last time there was one of these moments in 2008, when the global financial system broke down and we saw what the gambling of the banks had produced. And we saw governments rapidly move to transfer public wealth into the hands of the people responsible for that crisis, and then turned around. And just as I described is happening in Alberta, we saw on a massive and global scale, it being workers being forced to pay for the crisis created by the elites in the form of brutal economic austerity. There was tremendous political organizing in that moment, right? The slogan in Italy was, we won't pay for your crisis. And millions of people occupied squares around the world, including in the United States with Occupy Wall Street. And people saw the unfairness of it, and they called it out, and they said no. But what there wasn't in that key period of 2008, 2009, 2010, as the austerity really, really began to bite, what there wasn't was a clear, coherent, holistic, and organized alternative vision for how we should be organizing our societies, how we proposed to get out of crisis and stay out of crisis, to keep each other safe, right? There were pockets, to be sure, of people who had their alternatives, but there wasn't that coherent alternative, that coherent vision of where we want to go instead. And if there's one thing that gives me hope in this moment, it is that there has been so much intellectual work done over the past decade inside our movement, and particularly between our movements, coming out of our silos. The climate movement and the labor movement, which this discussion convened by Bargaining for the Common Good represents one of those silo-busting exercises, bringing together activists working for homes for all, for a jobs guarantee, for labor rights, for worker cooperatives, with the common imperative to keep the planet safe for all of us. And so we have been coming out of our silos, and we have been beginning to articulate, or more than beginning to articulate, what our vision for the next world looks like. One vision goes under the name a Green New Deal. Now, there are many visions of a Green New Deal out there, but April talked about the work that has been done in Washington State, that groundbreaking work that maybe didn't win a ballot measure because of the huge amount of money that was spent by fossil fuel companies, but nonetheless, that intellectual work fed into the national discussions about what a Green New Deal would look like, put forward by Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, picked up by Bernie Sanders and by the Warren campaign. And so now we have very articulated policies out there that bring together the demands of the care economy with the demands of the climate justice movement, and that are not a narrow carbon policy, but are really about what the next economy should look like. And so as the current economy fails, as workers who have been told that they are low skilled, not important, just working a so-called gig, right? In between jobs, maybe a hobby job, something for bored housewives to do, which is how Instacart has marketed this labor for so long as a justification for the neglect of these workers. All of the most denigrated workers in our economy are holding us together and feeling their power and expressing that sense of power now in so many different ways with such incredible courage. Just in the last few days, we've seen Amazon workers walk off the job. We've seen Instacart workers. We've seen, would that we'd have Instagram influencers walk off the job, then we'd really be in good shape. But Instacart workers, Whole Foods workers, General Electric workers at an aeronautic plant in Massachusetts, who are facing layoffs, saying, "Let us make ventilators," and having protests outside their factory, standing 6 feet apart. And of course, the incredible courage of nurses, across this country and around the world, who have been standing up for their right to protective equipment and their patients' right to be cared for by workers who are themselves cared for. We are seeing such tremendous leadership from workers in this moment, such gratitude for that labor, for the labor of care, expanding the definition of who is a care worker. Yes, it is nurses, but it's also the people who are keeping us fed. It is also the people who are cleaning buildings. I think we are in a moment where, because of all that intellectual and organizing work that has led up to this moment, all of that silo busting work, all of that bold visioning work for the next economy, and now this surge of worker power and worker appreciation that we need to build on. Look, this moment has to revolutionize us. Every minute seems to bring some new devastating piece of news that exposes a system that treats so many people as if they are disposable. Whether or not it is, a state like Alabama deciding that maybe we won't ventilate severely disabled people, right? Because we are all of the ways in which we already rank human life becomes visible. Or the news today that prisoners in Rikers are being offered the opportunity to dig mass graves in exchange for protective equipment. This is a moment that must revolutionize us. And so I want to thank you for this organizing work that you are doing. You have been engaging in the intellectual disaster preparedness that we have needed for so long to be able to be ready for a moment like this, in which we must change. So thank you. It's an honor to be with you today. I wish you all the best, and I'm with you. Thank you.
Thank you so very much, Naomi. There's again standing ovation written in the chat box. It's so inspiring, especially the charge for us on the left to really take advantage of this moment and not just let the right use sort of the shock for themselves. If you have time for one question, I'm looking towards. Is that okay? Yeah. So there was. I'll sort of clump together a few of them into one sort of overarching question, and I won't waste your time with me just trying to figure out the logistics of how I get my copy of Shock Doctrine signed by you and sent to me. We'll talk about that offline.
I'll wear gloves.
Okay. So there were lots of questions about, we now, both from the things that were studied and presented in your book and the examples that we all have lived through, we know that the right is going to sort of try and take advantage of this moment, and we're starting to see it already. There's a question about how do we both counter the narrative that has proven to be successful for them, of austerity and other things that they need to take advantage of. And then is there anything that we can do to really just block some of those things? Have we built enough power to actually block some of those things from happening?
Yeah, I mean, we do need to do better than we just did on the last stimulus bill, which was obviously a blow, right? I think what we saw is that we had enough power to get some important measures into. I mean, it's not a stimulus bill. It's a rescue bill. It's a bailout bill. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez described it as crumbs for our families, and it's not all families. It is not many, many immigrant families. I think you see the power of the strong trade unions, because the biggest wins were for the airline workers, who made sure that the bailout for their sector went to workers, as opposed to the first idea, which was just to give it to the companies, no strings attached. So that is an example of some really good pushback. But we didn't manage to stop a massive, massive corporate giveaway, a $500 billion trust, a slush fund that Steve Mnuchin is overseeing, really with absolute power. Because, I mean, I think people are aware there are some strings attached to the bailout money. In that, it says you can't use it for stock buybacks, you can't use it for, executive bonus, whatever. But then in the next paragraph it says, and all of this can be overridden by Steve Mnuchin. So these are not binding conditions. Steve Mnuchin is, a disaster capitalist extraordinaire who spent the last global financial crisis personally profiteering off of mass foreclosures of people's homes, evicting elderly people who were cents behind on their mortgage payments, became known as the foreclosure king. I mean, there is absolutely nothing reassuring about this story. And it isn't just that $500 billion. We're talking about really trillions of dollars when you combine the infusions from the Fed. So we were strong enough for crumbs. We were not strong enough to hold back this fire hose of cash that has been directed towards the corporate sector. The good news: this isn't our last chance. I mean, this is not in no way going to get us out of crisis, and there will be more attempts. And I think the main lesson of this last bailout is that the battle was lost when rescue for families was bundled in with the corporate rescue. That the fight needed to be over that bundling, and we needed Democrats to be absolutely unyielding in saying, you will not hold people in this country, who cannot pay their bills, who cannot feed their families, hostage to our need to make sure that there is real transparency for these corporate bailouts. They can be separate bills. They must be separate bills. As long as they're bundled, we lose all leverage, because what lawmaker is going to vote against such desperately needed cash? So that's the key piece of it, I think. And we need to lift up success stories. I mean, I want to shout out my colleagues from The Leap. And this is a group that I co-founded with some amazing people in Canada. It's now works around the world. If people are interested in it, they can check out theleap.org. But one of the things that we did with The Leap was a project with the Postal Workers Union in Canada called Delivering Community Power, which I think is a really good example of what you are talking about over the course of this conference, which is bargaining for the common good. Postal workers were facing severe austerity attacks. They were dealing with a government that wanted to shut down home mail delivery. Imagine if they'd succeeded in that in the midst of this pandemic. People are being kept alive by their postal delivery. But rather than just say, let's freeze things in time, let's just defend the post office as it currently exists. The LEAP and the Canadian Union of Postal Workers worked together to come up with a vision for the post office of the future that put the post office at the center of the transition to the post-carbon economy. So in practice, what that meant, a few things, charging stations outside of every post office for electric vehicles, solar panels on the roof, postal banking, but also a domestically made electric vehicle fleet, not just delivering the mail, but delivering locally grown produce and checking in on the elderly. And if you think about that kind of vision for the sort of the big picture of how we reimagine our sectors, think about how relevant that is in the midst of a pandemic like this, to have a postal fleet able to check in on people in isolation and be able to bring them fresh food grown locally. So, this is a think big moment. This is a think bold moment. Lord knows the people we're up against are thinking horrifically big.
Right.
So, we cannot be afraid to be bold in thinking about what people actually need to stay safe and healthy, to be safe and healthy, because so many people aren't safe or healthy right now.
Yeah. Thank you so much for that. I mean, as you probably imagine, there are so many questions for you in the comments. We're going to try and capture them and get them to you somehow. But just really on behalf of the 460 plus people who are on this call, listen to these remarks, thank you so absolutely much. And it's just such an honor to be fighting alongside you for the better future that we're all trying to build. So thank you so much. It was really an honor to introduce you and to chat with you.
Thanks, everybody. Good luck.
Thank you. All right, folks. So that was the best sort of intro and first session of a virtual convening that I have ever been to. Maybe of any convening that I've ever been to. Just a bunch of dynamic speakers right at the front end. We're going to keep it moving here with really two of my favorite people coming up into our next section. So this section is titled, What is BCG? What is Bargaining for the Common Good? And why is it a critical tool for the climate, environmental justice movements, and the labor movement in our collective fight? And it's my absolute pleasure to introduce one person who is my work husband, Sakib Bhatti, the co-director of ACRE campaigns along with me. And then my dear friend and role model, Judith Leblanc from the Native Organizers Alliance, who are going to walk us through this section. So I'll turn it over to you two.
So it's very, very, very moving to be with you at a time like this. My name is Judith LeBlanc. I am the director of the Native Organizers Alliance. I'm a citizen of the Caddo Nation of Oklahoma. I'm a grandma, and I am one of those Indians that walks with a high heel on one foot and a moccasin on the other. And I live in the middle of New York City, and I think you know what that may mean, given our situation. We're living in a moment when many are becoming aware of the interrelatedness of all living things and the natural world. There's a growing awareness of a core belief for Native peoples that we are in relationship. All living things and the natural world are in relationship. In essence, that is what bargaining for the common good is, frankly, being aware of how all beings, all living things are in relationship with the natural world and with each other. Our physical well-being, values, and spirituality, of course, as the other April and Naomi have spoken about, our values, our well-being, our spirituality is being challenged by the COVID-19 reality. How we act, what we do with such a crisis moment, and its impact on ourselves, our families, our communities, and the economy, and potentially democracy as a whole. So what we are experiencing, this new level of awareness of being in relationship, has been taught since the beginning of time amongst Native peoples. We call it being a good relative to nature, being a good relative to all. I saw this graphic of what I'm entitling Corona Change. I don't know if it's clear, it was very small, but I saw it online yesterday. I took note of one thing, that all of the people that are being tossed off their surfboards and flying through the air are white people, but whatever. The idea that we are in a place and a space where we've never been before, and that the uncertainty can seem overwhelming. And the truth is that life will never go back to what it was a few weeks ago, both in big and small ways. The major shift, as Naomi spoke about, is the interruption of the binary linear narrative of rugged individualism and segregation. The coronavirus, just as the climate crisis, has ignited an awareness that what we do together in response to this crisis matters. Traditional indigenous teachings tell us that we learn from the past, the ancestors, the practice of our ancestors, and walk in the present with our future and our descendants in mind, always guided by our values, our spiritual beliefs. The idea is the present is what brings together those two places in time and on the continuum. Bargaining for the common good will now be defined by the pandemic. The strategy of bargaining for the common good can utilize this interruption, this moment that we are in, the present, that we can utilize this strategy to interrupt the dominant narrative of rugged individualism, to build labor community action for transformational system change. Coronavirus is shining a spotlight, revealing the ongoing systemic, disproportionate economic and environmental crisis that we experience in Native communities and communities of color. You look at Elmhurst Hospital in New York City, one of the most diverse and immigrant communities, a public hospital. The Elmhurst Hospital was a public hospital, and it was the first hospital to be overwhelmed by the pandemic, overwhelmed. Or you look, for example, at the Huntwan Reservation, the Yankton Reservation in South Dakota, 7,000 Dakota citizens. The closest hospital, 2 hours away. No doctors, only nurses in the clinic. There are 100 ICU beds in the entire Indian Health Services, which is the health service that serves perhaps 35% of all Indian people, which means 35% of nearly 2 million people. Our tribes signed treaties that guaranteed healthcare from birth to death. This pandemic reveals for all to see how systemic racism affects our communities. It affects all of the hospitals in New York City, but Elmhurst was the first to be hit. The tribes all have land that have a land base and that are governing that land base are faced with a shortage that existed way before this pandemic. And yet, every day on Indian reservations and hospitals across the country, workers and our communities are responding despite the danger to themselves and the failure of the federal government. They are working to meet the needs of their reservations, their communities, and their cities for the common good. Bargaining for the common good means We lead with our values to define who has a stake in outcomes in union negotiations, in environmental justice struggles, in a time of political polarization, of crushing economic circumstances, or a pandemic. We must lead with our values. We must be good relatives, always mindful that all living things in the natural world are related. The far right has won the battle over the role of government and who controls revenue. They've won the battle narrative. Leading with values, by bargaining for the common good, it offers us the possibility to cut through ideological polarization and build support for common values, common good. Look at the teachers, Texas, Virginia, Oklahoma, when they went on strike. All of those states are historically, the popular opinion is against raising taxes, but now there's popular support that was built through the collective action of teachers and community for increasing taxes for the purposes of education, the common good. During the struggle to prevent the building of the Dakota Access Pipeline, we, Indian country, we interrupted the narrative of who Native peoples are in the 21st century. The Standing Rock Sioux tribe was struggling, was building a movement, bargaining and struggling for the common good, not just for their water supply or sacred sites. It was on behalf of the 17 million people who live and work and play along the Missouri River. Leading with our values are the guide to align beyond ideology and political polarization for the common good, for united action between labor and communities, native and non-native, for the good of all living things and Mother Earth.
Good afternoon, everyone, and good morning if you're on the West Coast. So I'm Bhatti. I'm with the Action Center on Race and the Economy, or ACRE, Maurice's organization. So along with the Center for Innovation and Worker Organization at Rutgers University and the Kalamanowicz Initiative for Labor and the Working Poor at Georgetown University, ACRE is proud to be one of the convening organizations of the Bargaining for the Common Good Network. And here are the faces of the members of our advisory committee for Bargaining for the Common Good. A group of visionary community and labor leaders from across different organizing networks in different cities and states across the country, community organizations and unions together. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what bargaining for the common good actually is and why it's needed. Political and economic power, as we all know in the US, has become hyper-concentrated in the hands of a relatively small number of financial institutions, mega corporations, and billionaires. And as a result, we find that when we fight to improve our communities, we find ourselves up against some of the most powerful people on the planet. So this reality creates an opportunity as well. This concentration at the top means that the same small set of corporations and billionaires that are driving and profiting from many different forms of injustice in our communities, and that the same folks that are fueling gentrification in our neighborhoods are also responsible for defunding public education, polluting our neighborhoods, profiting from predatory lending, and propping up a racist criminal justice system. And so enter bargaining for the common good, or BCG. BCG is ultimately about bringing concentrated community and labor power to bear on a common set of corporate villains that are standing in the way of the changes we want to see in both our communities and our workplaces. So just first things first, what is bargaining for the common good? Well, we define it as unions and community members partnering around a long-term vision for the structural changes they want to see in their communities and using union bargaining as a critical moment in a broader campaign to win that change. So I'm going to talk about the elements of bargaining for the common good campaigns. And as I'm going through these, please think about which of these elements your campaigns already have, which ones are missing, and which one or two you think you can add. So please share your thoughts in the chat box as I'm talking. So with that, let's go through the elements. The first one is the most foundational. Bargaining for the common good campaigns expand the scope of worker bargaining beyond just wages and benefits to include broader community issues. So for community organizations, this is important because fighting alongside workers in bargaining allows us to wield a lot more power. It's never been clearer than it is during this pandemic that workers are the ones who create value in our economy. Without workers, even the biggest corporation's business grinds to a halt. No one can deny at this moment that frontline workers are in fact essential. So by partnering with unions, we can leverage the uniquely immense power that workers have to win on the broader issues that affect our members' lives. For unions, as we become weaker, our reflex is to narrow what we bargain over. But in this moment, we need to expand what we're fighting for, because if we're fighting for something bigger, then we have more people fighting with us, and we need more people on our side if we want to win. This doesn't mean that we don't bargain over wages and benefits. Of course we do, but the fight can't end there. Furthermore, we need to remember that the problems we're facing in our workplaces are symptoms of broader problems in our economy and democracy, which also affect our members in countless ways outside of work. We need to have a joint long-term vision for how we will address these structural problems. We need to put forth demands that will chip away at those structural issues, and we need to plan campaigns that build long-term power that will allow us to win those demands over time. So the second element we want to talk about is going on offense by identifying, exposing, and challenging the real villains, the financial and corporate actors who profit from and drive social, economic, and policy in our social, economic, and political policy in our cities and states. These days, we find that the small set of power brokers very often hails from the finance, real estate, energy, and tech sectors. So many times, the most obvious target is not the most strategic one. For example, if our public officials aren't properly funding education, we can pound on their doors all we want and demand that they look under the couch cushions to find more money. But as long as they feel more beholden to their corporate donors and their constituents, that won't happen, because the only way to give us what we want is by rolling back tax subsidies and making big corporations pay their fair share. So we need to target the corporate tax dodgers and make their political money toxic if we want to be able to get services that we need funded. This is why, for example, one of the most powerful actions during the Chicago teacher strike last fall was at the offices of Sterling Bay, a developer that is getting $1.3 billion in tax subsidies to build the luxury Lincoln Yards housing development, while the city and the school district cry broke. Similarly, if our public officials don't rein in polluting industries, then we need to take our demands directly to those corporations and their investors. Third, in BCG campaigns, unions need to engage community allies as full partners in developing campaign demands and strategy. This means unions can't just figure out which common good demands they want to push and then recruit community partners to join them. That sets up community partners as junior partners in this relationship whose issues are secondary. True partnership isn't lending power, it's sharing power in order to become more powerful. So what does that look like? Well, unions typically do bargaining surveys at the start of a contract campaign. What if there was also a bargaining survey that went to the community partners, asking what their members need to win from the contract campaign? San Diego County workers at SEIU Local 221 did this very effectively. They did a survey to figure out the most pressing community issues, figured out how those community issues were actually reflected in the working conditions of union members, and developed bargaining demands that would improve the outcomes for community members by improving working conditions for union members. Next, we need to center racial justice in our demands. We know that the capitalist system we live in requires an underclass that can be exploited and targeted for the worst extraction. We know that in our communities and across the world, people of color are targeted to bear a disproportionate share of this extraction. In the US, corporations prey on Black, Indigenous, and Latinx families in particular. It's not a coincidence that polluting factories are always located in communities of color. There's a reason why our officials invest in public schools in white suburbs and push charter schools in Black and brown cities. We know that we cannot solve the crisis in our communities unless and until we address this racial targeting up front. This means we can't settle for race-neutral demands that will lift up all boats. No, we need racially explicit demands that start by repairing this harm to Black, brown, and Indigenous communities, specifically not only because it's the right thing to do, but also because we can't dismantle this oppressive system any other way. So next, to be able to do all this effectively, we need to strengthen internal organizing, membership, and member engagement. Bargaining for the common good campaigns only work if our people, both community and union members, understand the importance of fighting together. These campaigns require a deep level of radical solidarity that is only possible through lots of difficult conversations that start with acknowledging and confronting our sometimes tenuous histories together in the past, developing a shared analysis around the structural problems we're facing, and starting to build trust. Importantly, we need to put members of our organizations in direct contact with each other. Once we get through social distancing, of course, we need them to build with each other in unscripted settings so they can build relationships that are actually deep, right? These campaigns only work if our members are willing to go to the mat with each other. Next, we must leverage capital in our campaigns. By this, I mean workers' pension funds and university endowments. The reality is that we are one of the biggest sources of funding for our opposition. The corporations that are extracting wealth and resources from our communities are doing it with the dollars that our pension funds, retirement plans, and universities are investing in their businesses. By leveraging that power, state workers in New Jersey got their pension fund to put pressure on private equity firms to put a moratorium on foreclosures in Puerto Rico following Hurricane Maria. The billionaire class is using our money against us. We need to claim that power for ourselves, and this is how we can do that. And last, but certainly not least, a key element of bargaining for the common good is that the campaign doesn't end once the union settles its contract, right? This is about building long-term community labor power, not about giving unions some good publicity during a contract fight. This doesn't mean that the union can't settle until every single community demand is met. I mean, let's be clear. If we're fighting for structural changes, structural change does not happen in one contract cycle. But it does mean that the boss doesn't automatically become a good actor once a contract is settled. And it means that the community's demands don't become any less important. The broader common good demands are not a bargaining chip. They're part of a long-term vision that all parties, community and union, are committed to winning over the next several bargaining cycles and beyond. So those are the key elements of bargaining for the common good campaigns. I'm going to kick it back to Judith now to talk about why the strategy is particularly important and useful in fighting for climate and environmental justice.
Thank you. As the impact of the coronavirus deepens, bargaining for the common good becomes the most powerful strategy to reframe popular thinking about the role of the labor movement in social change, despite the fact that a majority of people, workers, are unorganized. Bargaining for the common good can affect how each individual, each sector fits within community, and that we are all related. It's seen quite strikingly in the way that people are thinking about, responding to, the way the media is talking about the health of healthcare workers, because healthcare workers' health has an impact on whether or not we'll be able to survive this pandemic. Naomi brought up an example of how workers and the labor movement are leading the way, responding to the crisis. She spoke about the electrical workers, members of the International Union of Electrical Workers at General Electric, which is based in Lynn, Massachusetts. She spoke about how the workers in that plant walked out yesterday. I want to read this quote from the president of the local, and I have feel a deep sense of pride because my father and his family worked in that plant. He said, most Americans are not aware that the best ventilators are already made by General Electric within the company's healthcare division. Just last week, General Electric laid off nearly 2,600 workers and temporarily laid off 50% of its maintenance staff. If GE trusts us to build, maintain, and test engines which go on a variety of aircraft where millions of lives are at stake, why wouldn't they trust us to build ventilators? We are in a moment when labor and other social movements have the opportunity to take up bargaining for the common good on an array of critical issues. And the fact is that we're in a situation in New York where the governor is already talking about cuts in Medicaid and education due to the pandemic. Teachers and healthcare worker unions can lead the way in the budget fight with potentially the broadest base of support ever. Our communities have been forever changed by the coronavirus, but also the role of good governance, the role of government, the role of labor will also be changed. As we move forward and beyond this immediate period of crisis, the climate crisis will once again become a focus for all. When the forest fire season begins in California, when the hurricane season begins on the East Coast, when there's flooding along the rivers in the center of the country, the climate crisis will once again be on center stage, sharing it with the impact of the pandemic. Last year, the UN issued a report which said that 1 million plant and animal species are endangered. The report said ecosystems, species, wild populations, local varieties and breeds of domesticated plants and animals are shrinking, deteriorating, or vanishing. The essential, interconnected web of life on Earth is getting smaller and increasingly frayed. This loss is a direct result of human activity and constitutes a direct threat to human well-being in all ages, regions of the Earth. They said climate crisis is the result of human beings being out of good relationship with nature, with the natural world. Science is catching up with traditional indigenous knowledge, and the role and the importance of traditional indigenous knowledge, but also the role and importance of tribal and native leadership in the struggle to save Mother Earth is a critical way that the labor movement and Native peoples can work together. The movements to protect Mother Earth and how the working class shares the leadership with Native peoples and tribal nations will continue to be the most basic question facing humanity. The treaties signed with the US government remain the law of the land. Even under a right-leaning Supreme Court, they continue to support treaty rights. Last year, 2 cases were decided recognizing treaty rights. Why? Because treaty rights are guaranteed by the Constitution, and the libertarian, the right-leaning Supreme Court justices know that once they begin to try to tamper with the Constitution, all bets are off. Treaty rights outline the moral, inherent, and legal right of tribes to be caretakers of and govern the use and protection of water, land, and air. Labor and other social movements have the possibility of challenging the domination of big oil and respond to the climate crisis if we form these alliances. And now it will be an even bigger challenge due to the pandemic, the impact on regulations, the austerity budgets, the high unemployment and poverty. But labor and Native-led environmental justice movements must be the path to bargaining for the common good to save Mother Earth. We have to learn to be good relatives. You know, last week, there was a very important legal victory, one in the case the Standing Rock Sioux tribe has pursued to demand a full environmental impact study of the Dakota Access Pipeline. The basis of the win was that the company and the US government had violated the 1851 Treaty on Land Use. And now the company and the government must now redo the environmental impact study, which potentially could shut down the Dakota Access Pipeline. Look, the US government negotiated these treaties to legalize land grabs and the subjugation of Native peoples. But those treaties are at the same time the bottom line at this point in the 21st century, the bottom line for protecting Mother Earth. Native peoples in every major environmental justice struggle are bargaining for the common good with our treaty rights. In system change, if we are pressing for the kind of system change that can protect Mother Earth, we have to relate that struggle to contract negotiations, or the struggle to defend the sacred in Mother Earth or protecting our communities will be lost. We have to see the issues of the environment and protecting the community as part and parcel of the contract negotiations. And that is already begun to happen in LA, in Chicago, in Texas, many places. So I believe that this strategy of bargaining for the common good can drive a transformational system change in the interests of workers, communities, and tribal nations. So this conference couldn't be happening at a better time, and we could not have a better group of people sitting down together to figure out how we can take the next steps together. Thank you.
Thanks, Judith. So as many of you know, we've done several bargaining for the common good conferences over the past 6 years, focused on issues like bargaining for racial justice, bargaining for housing justice, bargaining for common good in higher education. These conferences have all helped seed many groundbreaking campaigns over the years. So as we were planning this conference, we started thinking about what it would look like to have a ton of bargaining for the common good campaigns happening all across the country at the same time. How could that help us win structural changes all across the country? So we started by building a database of all union contract expirations that we could come up with over the next few years. And what we realized is that there will be about 3 million workers who will be bargaining contracts in 2022. So here is a very quick, incomprehensible glance at what that list looks like. So what if we make a coordinated effort to try to get as many of the unions who will be bargaining in 2022 to adopt a bargaining for the common good framework? How much more could community organizations and unions win together across the country if we're all leveraging the bargaining moment to take on the force of capital in order to force them to fix the structural problems of our communities? So, with bargaining for the common good, we're going to build a website that has all these contract expirations, and we're going to put them on a map. This is still a work in progress, so we invite you to, if you don't see your contract on there, please send it to us, and we'll put it on there as well. So we're going to overlay the contract expirations with city and state budget cycles, since we know that's another key compression point for many community organizations and unions alike. We're also going to break this map down by sector so we can start to think about how these campaigns can naturally build on each other across the country. So the big idea here is look at all the things that the Chicago teachers were able to win last fall during their strike. You can find out more about that by looking at the webinar, which is in your registration packets. In the next session, you'll hear about the tremendous things that the LA teachers were able to win last year during their strike, and the janitors in Minnesota won last month. We also will have a webinar with Minnesota janitors coming up in April. We wanted to take all of that and multiply it by 100, by 1,000, by 1,000,000. What would it look like to have all these groundbreaking, power-shifting fights playing out all over the country at the same time? We're really excited to find out. So for those of you who'll be staying with us for the rest of the conference, you'll learn more about how to plug in. But for those of you who are going to leave us, if you find this exciting, we want to hear from you. So we'd be happy to help plan regional convenings, once we're allowed to do that, and to help make plans, train, and strategize with your teams. So please email us at bargainingforthecommongood@gmail.com, and we'll be in touch. Great. So with that, I'll turn it back over to Maurice.